Bury Me Screaming by P.J. Thorndike. England, 1972. The windscreen wipers fought against the torrential downpour, sweeping the rain back and forth as Peter struggled to see through the blurry glass at the taillights of the car in front. It had only got worse once they had joined the M3 and showed no signs of abating as they approached Shepperton. "Blast this foul weather," Peter grumbled. "Whatever happened to a white Christmas?" Sandra flipped the radio off. It had been playing Christmas carols for the past half hour, lending a false sense of jollity to a journey that was inconvenient and most likely going to be unpleasant. She didn't know why she had turned the radio on in the first place, but she felt that she had to make some effort, if only for the sake of her own spirits. They turned off the motorway and wound their way through Shepperton. As they crossed Squires Bridge into Littleton, Sandra glanced at the black trees that hung over the stone balustrade, sombre in the downpour. They loomed even larger than she remembered, bigger, more ominous. Doesn't the council ever cut them back, she wondered. The River Ash that flowed sluggishly beneath the bridge was little better. It was clogged with tall reeds and dead, rotting leaves. They turned in through the stone gates with their barely legible sign stating "The Yews" and rolled up the gravel drive to the red brick house. Its stone porch and bay windows made an ugly and severe face. home again, jiggity jig," said Peter. Sandra said nothing. The Yews hadn't been her home for a long time. If it ever had been, then that was so long ago that she barely remembered it. To her, it was just a house full of unwanted memories. "Looks like Tom and Joan have beaten us to it," said Peter, glancing at Tom's red Triumph Spitfire, parked close to the porch, the rain drumming on its black convertible top. "Ready to make a run for it?" "I'll get the casserole, you fetch the things from the boot. You're on." Sandra reached into the back seat and lifted out the casserole dish. It was still warm. She had done her best to secure the tinfoil so that none of the steam could escape. They got out of the car, and Peter hurried around to the boot while Sandra ran up to the porch, cradling the casserole. She rang the doorbell and peered through the stained-glass side windows. The hall light was on, and she could see the movement of someone approaching. It was Joan who opened the door. She was dressed in a turquoise caftan with matching headband. Joan was ever stylish, always dressed in something from Bieber or Harrods. Sandra could never shake the suspicion that she privately sneered at her flowery Laura Ashley frocks and pearl necklaces. "Hello there," Joan said, planting a kiss on Sandra's cheek, taking care not to let her caftan touch the casserole dish. "What rotten weather! Is Peter getting drenched?" "Here I am," said Peter, hurrying up to the porch, a large suitcase in each hand. "Why Sandra felt the need to pack all this lot when we're only staying one night, I've no idea." "Well, come in and dry off. Tom's in the parlour, starting early." They shuffled into the hall, and Sandra was immediately reminded of the sombreness of the house. It hadn't changed, and it never would. Books lined the walls, and Gothic statues of fauns and satyrs peopled the rooms. Dark wallpaper and varnished wood made the corners and alcoves gloomy nests of shadows, which resounded with the ticking of the old grandfather clock. This was Father's house. It had never been theirs. "I say, have you brought grub?" asked Tom, as he poured himself a glass of whisky from the side table in the parlour. "As promised," says Sandra. "Chicken casserole. It might need a little warming up. I'll turn on the oven. Where's Father?" "In his study, of course. Hi, Peter. Scotch?" "Yes, please, Tom," said Peter, setting the suitcases down and running his hands through his wet hair. "Gin and tonic for me," said Sandra, as she went into the kitchen. "Oh, Tom, look at the state of the place. I thought Father had a girl come in once a week to help out." "Not any more," Tom called. "She stopped coming for some reason." "What on earth for?" "Doesn't like the place," came their father's voice from the top of the stairs. "None of them do. Can't stand it. Or perhaps it's me they can't stand." Sandra stepped out of the kitchen and looked up at her father. He looked awful. The tatty cardigan draped around him was the same one he had been wearing the last time she had seen him. His hair was unkempt, and he hadn't shaved for at least 3 days. For some reason she was put in mind of those overgrown trees drooping over Squires Bridge, wretched old things left to run wild. "Are you all right, Father?" she asked. "Of course I am. I'm glad you're all here. That dinner I can smell?" "Yes, I'm just warming it up." "Good. I'll be down shortly. I just have a few things to take care of." They watched him shuffle back into his study, which opened onto the landing. He shut the door behind him. Sandra couldn't imagine what he found to do in there. He had stopped work years ago, shortly after their mother had died. That had been the end of him, really. It had been the end of a lot of things. Tom had been a teenager and was hit hardest by her death. Sandra had been 10 and had felt utterly lost. Father had done his best to usher them into adulthood, but their childhoods had died the day Mum had been struck on the head by a large jar of pickled onions that had fallen from a high shelf in the pantry. It was Tom who found her, lying face down on the floor in a pool of blood. One silly accident and all their happiness had evaporated, leaving them as shells of their former selves, much like the house which they had been so desperate to move out of once they were old enough, Tom to college and Sandra to her doctor's surgery in London where she had met Peter. Their respective lives had flowered once they had left the U's and their father behind them. The house and the man were one and the same in Sandra's mind, not quite forgotten, but best left in the past. Now, here they all were again. Why? Tom passed a gin and tonic to Sandra. "How are the kids?" "Oh, fine, with Peter's sister. Looking forward to Christmas?" "Naturally. Simon has his heart set on a skateboard. Good for him." "Has father given you any hint as to what all this is about?" "No, and I can't imagine for the life of me why he wants us both here now after all these years." "Perhaps he's lonely," Tom scoffed. "Lonely? Father? That old man has pushed people away all his life. You can't imagine he's become sentimental in his old age." "No, I suppose not." Sandra went back into the kitchen and put the casserole in the oven. She got some plates out of a cupboard, and, as she passed the sink, she glanced out of the windows at the dark trees that enveloped the house on all sides. The back of the house faced the forested edge of Littleton Park with its 17th-century manor house to which the Yews had originally been the gatekeeper's lodge. The dense vegetation hid a number of relics from what had once been the manor's recreational gardens. As children, Sandra and Tom had often pretended to be jungle explorers, occasionally coming across the foundations of boathouses and ornamental statues, forgotten and moss-encrusted like the remnants of a lost civilization. There had been an old shed that had become their clubhouse, and they had painted it with whitewash and put an old rug in there to make it cosy. Father had eventually forbidden them from playing there. It was dangerous, he had said, playing around in an old derelict. He had plans to tear it down and build something on its foundations, but never got around to it. It was out there still, she supposed, all rotten and falling apart now. She carried the plates into the dining room and began setting the table. She got no help from the others, but that was to be expected. Tom and Peter stood by the fireplace, sipping their drinks and talking about the drive down. Joan watched them from the sofa, looking fabulous, her feet curled up under her, cradling a martini rosso in one hand, a cigarette in the other. Once the table had been set, Sandra opened one of the suitcases and began taking out a few things. The small artificial Christmas tree had got a little bent during the journey, and some of the ornaments had fallen off, but she fixed it up as best she could and placed it on the side table in the hall. Then she took out a length of silver tinsel and started fixing it to the mantelpiece. "You never give up on him, do you?" said Tom, a pitying smile on his face. "What?" "On father. All this. Christmas ornaments." "I just thought to make it nice for him." "Father hasn't celebrated Christmas since Mum died, and even when we were kids he wasn't really into it. Christmas was Mum's thing." "All right then, I'm doing it for us. Why not? It is Christmas after all, and we shan't be seeing you again until the new year." "Well, I think it's nice of Sandra," said Joan, "even if the tree is plastic. We have a noble fir at home, enormous great thing, cost a bit more than the regular ones, but they keep their needles longer, and I can't abide the mess you get with cheap trees." Sandra said nothing as she stood back to admire her work. A small plastic tree and a bit of tinsel didn't do much for the gloomy old place. Perhaps she was being foolish, but Tom's mention of Mum had awoken memories in her of how Christmases used to be at the Yews. There was still a box of Mum's homemade ornaments in the airing cupboard upstairs, she was sure of it. She doubted that Father had thrown them out. He never threw anything out, which is why the place was such a mess. She left the others and went upstairs to fetch them. As she passed the open door to the bathroom, she repressed a shudder. She hated that bathroom, with its moss-green tiles and stained-glass window that made everything the wrong colour. She hated the Victorian plumbing that clanked and groaned whenever anybody turned on a tap, and she hated the flecked mirror that had frightened her as a child. It always made her worry that she might look up from spitting out her toothpaste and find somebody else staring back at her. But this was silly childish nonsense. It was a perfectly normal bathroom, even if it was old and ugly. It just had something about it that she couldn't abide, and she couldn't quite put her finger on it. To her, it was the ugly, rotten heart of the house, a symptom of the sickness that had set into their family all those years ago. She opened the airing cupboard and rummaged through the detritus of happier years, board games, blankets, and boxes of knickknacks, things that reminded her of Mum, things that Father had shovelled in here to keep them out of sight and out of mind. There, the box marked Xmas Dex was dog-eared and half-squashed, but it evoked a warm feeling in Sandra. That was Mum's handwriting. She remembered her and Tom getting that very box out year after year and decorating the tree together with Mum smiling on. That had been a lifetime ago. Well, by God, the others could laugh all they wanted, but this year those decorations were coming out again. The box was at the back of the cupboard, and she had to lean in to reach it. She was standing on her tiptoes, her whole head inside the cupboard, when she heard it. Scratching. A faint scrabbling that grew steadily louder. Oh, wonderful. Rats. Of course there were rats in this rotten old house. They had probably eaten through every last decoration and a good many other things besides. She opened the box and looked inside. Colourful decorations made from pipe cleaners, ping-pong balls and cotton wool greeted her eyes like long-buried treasure. Pine cones painted silver and baubles crested with sequins and glitter. She started suddenly as she felt a hand grab her calf and squeeze hard. She was wearing corduroy trousers, but the coldness of the touch seeped through the fabric and into her flesh like ice. "Tom, if you think that's funny," she said, as she ducked back out of the cupboard to turn around. Nobody was there. She looked up and down the hallway and then peered over the banister. The others were still downstairs talking. She glanced at the door to Father's study. It was closed. In fact, the only door on the landing that was open was the one to the bathroom. She could still feel the cold impression of whatever had touched her. It almost felt like a wet patch on her trouser leg. She reached down and rubbed it. It was dry and the coldness began to dissipate with a few rubs. She shuddered. This bloody house. "I say, how's that dinner coming along?" asked Tom as she came downstairs with the box of decorations. "Should be just about ready." "Good, I'll open up some burgundy." "You really came prepared, didn't you?" "As you said, it is Christmas." "Pour me a glass, a large one." They drifted into the dining room and Sandra called for Father to come down. He did so, shuffling all the way, and took his place at the head of the table. Tom poured out the wine and Sandra served up the casserole. Nobody spoke. The silence was pregnant with expectation. "Well, how about a toast?" said Peter helpfully. He raised his glass. "To family." "Hear, hear," said Tom, raising his own glass and then polishing off half of it. "Take it easy, Tom," said Joan disapprovingly. "You don't have to get drunk at every opportunity." "Who's getting drunk? I'm having a glass of wine with my dinner, if it's all right with you." "And the whiskey you were knocking back before dinner? Peter only had one." "Peter got here late. More fool him. Now stop being a bore. It's Christmas after all, and this happy little family is back together." He drained his glass while everybody else looked at theirs uncomfortably. "Now then, Father, isn't it about time you told us what all this is about?" "Very well," said their father. "I'll get straight to it. I'm nearing the end of my life now, and I don't want to die in this house. I want to sell it and live out my final days somewhere else." They stared at him as if he had gone mad. "But Father," said Sandra, "you've always said how much you love this house, and that you'd never leave it." "That was in the past. I'm done with it." "Well, damn you all, why are you all staring at me like that? I'd have thought you'd both be ecstatic to be shot of the place before I kick the bucket. Get me in a home, start spending your inheritance. Isn't that what you've both been planning for years?" "This is a little sudden, Father," said Tom. "You mean you really want to sell up? If it's the costs of residential care you're thinking of, then renting this place out would surely cover them." "No!" their father almost shouted, slamming the palm of his hand down on the table. "I want to be rid of this place, and I want you to be rid of it too. I don't want either of you living in here after I'm gone. Let it be somebody else's problem." Sandra and Tom glanced at each other. The thought of ever living here again had never crossed Sandra's mind, and she doubted it had crossed Tom's either. But selling the place? "Is there a problem with the house you're not telling us?" Sandra asked. "I heard rats earlier." "Rats?" their father said. "Yes, scratching about in the airing cupboard. We can get somebody in to clear them out." "There's no rats here. I put out traps for them, and they're always left untouched. Even the rats steer clear of this place." "But the scratching—" "I want to sell the place. Can't you listen? I'm sick of it. I'm sick of the memories, and it's been a burden to me for all these years. I don't want my children to suffer the same burden." "Very well," said Tom, "we'll sell it. But it'll have to wait for the new year, and the market is so dismal at the moment I don't think we'd get our money's worth. It might be better to wait." "No," their father said. "I've waited long enough. I don't care how much I get for it. I just want it gone. I want to be free of it. Oh, you kids, you don't understand. How could you? But I've lived with this damn place for too long now, and she won't leave me alone. Always scratching, always whispering." "Who won't leave you alone?" Tom asked. But their father wasn't listening. He was talking as if they weren't there, cursing somebody they couldn't see. "She's more of a nuisance now than she used to be. I think she suspects I want to leave. Why can't she ever leave me alone?" "Father?" Sandra asked, sharing a nervous glance with Tom. "Even after all these years, she's still here." "Take it easy, Alan," said Peter, his face a mask of professional concern. "He's gone mad," Tom hissed to Sandra. "All alone in this place for years on end. His mind's cracked." "Shall I fetch something from my bag?" Peter said to them. "A sedative, perhaps?" "I don't need any of your quack's tricks," Alan said. "Nothing wrong with my mind. I'm just sick of this damned place." "Father, you were just raving about somebody not leaving you alone," said Tom. "Whatever my reasons, it's my house, and I'll sell it if I want to." He got up, apparently finished with both dinner and their company, and headed for the stairs. Tom followed him out. Sandra sighed, and Peter poured them all another glass of wine. They tried to make conversation as they finished their dinner, but the sound of Tom and their father arguing on the stairs kept seeping into the room. "Don't tell me what I can and can't do with my own house," Father said at last. "Now I'm turning in. I'll see you all in the morning." Dinner over, Joan went out to speak with Tom, while Sandra and Peter began clearing away the dinner things. As Sandra carried their plates out to the kitchen, she could hear Tom and Joan talking in the other room. "Selling the place now is mad, I tell you," Tom was saying. "It's perfectly situated for London commuters. We can make a packet renting it."
"Darling, think of all the effort involved," Joan said. "It'll take 6 months to get this old dump suitable for city commuters. There'll be damp, dry rot, you name it. And Sandra said she heard rats. Do what your father asks and help him sell the place. It's your inheritance. Think of what we could do with the cash." "She doesn't miss a trick," said Peter as he started filling the sink with hot water. "She's right, though," said Sandra. "Oh, I'm sure we could easily rent the place, but I'm a father's mite. I'd rather be shot of it." "It's all a bit odd, though, isn't it? I mean, your father has barricaded himself in this house for years, resisting all suggestions that he should move to somewhere more manageable. And now he's talking about care homes? Perhaps Tom's right. Perhaps he has had some sort of breakdown." There came an awful scream from the other room, a woman's scream, high and terrified. Sandra and Peter glanced at each other. Joan. They rushed out into the parlour and found her squatting by the sofa, clutching its arm for support with one hand, the other covering her face. She was hysterical. "Joan, whatever's the matter?" Peter asked. "Where's Tom?" The front door opened and Tom came in. It was still raining outside, and he shook the water off him like an old dog. An unopened bottle of scotch was in his hand. "One down, one to go," he said cheerfully. "I say, what's up with Joan?" "There was a woman," said Joan, her voice cracked with terror. "In the corner, over there." They followed her shaking finger and looked at an alcove between a bookcase and the wall. It was cloaked in gloom. "She was screaming." "A screaming woman?" Peter said. "The only screams we heard were from you, Joan." "No, you don't understand. Her mouth was screaming, but there was no sound. Just her face contorting itself. Oh, God, her face!" "What's this nonsense?" Tom said. He had gone suddenly very pale. "A screaming woman?" "Yes," said his wife. "In the corner over there. I only saw her for a moment. I covered my eyes and then she was gone." "Your imagination, surely," said Peter. "That's a gloomy old alcove over there, and this ghastly wallpaper will make you see anything." "I'm telling you there was a woman there," said Joan, angrily now. "Drink some of this," said Tom, cracking the seal on the second bottle of scotch. "We're all tired, and this damn house is playing tricks on you." He poured Joan a large measure, and then a larger one for himself, before gulping it down. "What's that smell?" said Sandra, wrinkling her nose. "You're right, there is a stench of something," said Peter. "Something mouldy and damp." "Probably the smell of wet leaves outside," said Tom. "Wafted in when I had the door open. It's still chucking it down out there." "When was the last time the guttering was cleared?" said Peter. "It's probably stuffed with rotting leaves." Joan had taken a few sips of her whisky, and it seemed to settle her nerves. She was calmer now, more collected. "I know it's not my place," she said, "but I do wish you two would listen to your father and sell this bloody house." There was little else to be done that evening but go to bed. Everybody was tired and emotionally exhausted. Nobody felt like staying up and making merry except Tom, who made a good dent in the second bottle of scotch, while Sandra brushed her teeth in the kitchen sink. She was always keen to avoid the upstairs bathroom and all its hideousness. As she passed Tom on the way up the stairs, she saw that he was gazing into the dying flames of the fire, deep in thought. "Look, Tom," she said, "you really don't believe Joan saw anything, do you?" "No, of course not." "Well, after what Father was saying at dinner table." "Well, that's just it. This is a creepy old house, always has been, but that's all it is. Father's nonsense at dinner just frightened Joan, that's all. No wonder she's jumping at shadows after his little outburst." "Tom, when I was upstairs before dinner, looking for those decorations, I felt something." "Felt something?" "Something grabbed my leg when I had my head in the airing cupboard." He looked at her long and hard, and then, as if something had won a battle inside him, scoffed at what she was saying. "Don't you bloody start." "Well, what's your explanation?" "I don't have one, and neither do you. This is a rotten old house full of draughts and rats. None of us like it here, so our minds start playing tricks on us, seeing things in the shadows, jumping at noises, filling in the gaps with our imaginations. Simple psychology. Ask Peter. He'll agree with me and can probably put it into better terms." "I suppose you might be right. Good night." "Night." She went upstairs to what had once been her old room. Posters of ponies and Ricky Nelson still decorated the walls. Peter was getting undressed. "Tom not gone to bed yet?" he asked as he buttoned up his pyjamas. "No, I think he's intent on polishing off that bottle of scotch first. He'll end up with a liver the size of a watermelon if he carries on like that. He's always been a big drinker, but this house seems to bring it on even more." They got into bed and listened to the rain hammering on the windows. After a while, a creak on the stairs told Sandra that Tom had finally decided to go to bed. It was still raining when she woke up, roused by some noise that seemed to be all around her in the impenetrable darkness. It was the scratching again, louder than it had been in the airing cupboard. That couldn't be rats. It was something much larger, scraping and moving about in the walls. Peter was still snoring softly beside her. She rolled over and picked up her watch from the bedside table. By angling it to catch what little light there was from the window, she could just make out the time. 3:15. She lay back and listened to the scratching and scrabbling. It was so loud it almost drowned out the wind and lashing rain outside. Then there was a scream that cut through it all like a knife, the same high-pitched shriek of terror they had heard before. It sounded like Joan again, and this time it came from the landing. Sandra sat bolt upright. The scream trailed off and was swallowed by several heavy thuds as if somebody had taken a tumble down the stairs. "Oh, God!" Sandra cried. Peter had been roused by the noise too, but Sandra was first out of the room, running to the banister in her nightie. There, at the bottom of the stairs, lay Joan, her neck bent at an unnatural angle, head tilted up, wide eyes staring at the ceiling. "Christ, what's happened?" said Peter, appearing at Sandra's side. "It's Joan. She's fallen down the stairs. Oh, do something, Peter." Belting on his dressing gown, Peter hurried down the stairs. He bent down to check Joan's pulse. He looked up at Sandra, his face grim, and shook his head. "Neck's broken." "What's all that on her face?" Even from the top of the stairs, Sandra could see the long streaks of blood that ran from the crown of Joan's head down to her lips. "Lacerations," said Peter. "Must have scratched herself as she fell, or banged her face against the rails." "She couldn't have done that to herself," said Sandra as she came down the stairs. "Oh, God, look at her face!" Joan's lifeless gaze was one of frozen terror. The mouth hung open in a wide O of horror, and all the whites of her eyes were showing. The scratches were deep, as if some wild animal had taken a swipe at her face. "Yes, I think you're right," said Peter. "Those cuts are deep." "What's all the noise out here?" said Tom, emerging from his room, hair dishevelled. "Oh, Tom," said Sandra, "I'm so sorry." "What?" Tom stood at the top of the stairs and looked down. At first his face didn't seem to comprehend what he was looking at. He gazed at the three of them blearily, his eyes coming to rest on the motionless form of his wife last. "Joan? Oh, God, Joan!" He half ran, half stumbled down the stairs to fall at his wife's side. "She's dead, I'm afraid, Tom," said Peter. Tom cradled her head in his hands as he wept. "What happened? What did this to her?" "She must have left her room for some reason and then took a wrong footing," said Peter. "These scratches," said Tom. "Was she attacked?" Peter turned to Sandra. "Has your father recently got a cat?" "No," said Sandra. "He hates cats." "His study door is open." Sandra looked up the stairs. The door to Father's study was directly opposite the stairs, and it was ajar. "Strange. He always keeps it shut." "An open window, perhaps? Some animal got in and—" Sandra went up the stairs and pushed the door to the study open. The room, like the house, hadn't changed since she had been a child. Framed collections of butterflies lined the walls. Stuffed owls glared down from the tops of bookshelves. Dust lay thick over everything except Father's desk, which was strewn with papers. The big leaded glass window behind the desk was shut. Nothing had got in here. But perhaps something had come out, attacked Joan on the landing, knocked her backwards. There was a stench, too, an awful musty smell of old, damp earth. "That smell," said Peter, joining her in the study, "is the same smell from earlier, a sort of mouldy earth smell." "Yes, I don't know what it is. Something to do with all this rain?" "Well, I'd better call the police, I suppose." Peter picked up the black receiver from Father's desk and tapped the cradle a few times. "Phone's out," he said, replacing the receiver. "The wind must have blown a tree down on the lines." "Oh, I don't believe this," said Sandra. They went back downstairs. Tom had left Joan's side and was at what was left of the whiskey bottle again, pouring himself one glass, drinking it, and then pouring another. "Take it easy with that stuff, Tom," Peter warned. "We need clear heads. The police have to be contacted, but the phones are out. Help me move Joan into the other room, and then I'll head into Shepperton and see if I can't rouse them." "I should go," said Tom. "You are in no state to drive, and I want you here to look after Sandra. Now come on, you take the feet, and I'll take the arms." "Oh, Jesus," Tom whimpered at the thought of lifting his dead wife like a sack of potatoes. But really, it wouldn't do to leave her lying at the foot of the stairs.
Together, with much weeping on Tom's part, they carried her into the other room and lay her down on the circular rug. Peter fetched a bedsheet from upstairs and draped it across her. "There," he said, "that'll have to do for now. I'll just get changed and then I'll head off." They said nothing as Peter got his coat and left the house. Sandra stood by the bay window and watched the lights of their car vanish down the drive. "Should we tell father?" Tom asked. "No need to wake him now. It can wait until morning, or at least until the police arrive." "God, I just don't understand it. I don't understand how this could have happened. I remember Joan getting up because she kept hearing those rats scrabbling about. I told her there was nothing she could do about it, but she left the room anyway. I must have fallen asleep again, because the next thing I knew there was a lot of loud voices on the stairs. I came out and saw her just lying there." "I heard the scratching too, only I don't think it was rats." "What else could it have been?" said Tom irritably. "It was something bigger, and you saw those scratches on Joan's face. No rat did that." "What then?" "I don't know. I just can't get the image out of my head of a person's hands, scratching away at something." "A person? Oh, come on, Sandra. My life is lying dead in there, and you still want to tell ghost stories? I tell you, I'm not in the mood." "Peter gone then?" said a voice from the top of the stairs. It was father, dressed in his cardigan and slippers. Sandra wondered if he had slept in that ratty old get-up. "Yes, he's gone to fetch the police," she told him. "There's been an accident." "I know, I heard you all." "Did we wake you?" "I wasn't sleeping. I rarely do these days." "You heard it, and you didn't even come out of your room," said Tom. "That's a fine way to behave. My wife just died, father. I would have thought that you'd have had the decency to show your face." "Do you see now why I have to sell this house?" their father said, his face devoid of all emotion, except the weight of many years of loneliness and fear. "Do you see why I have to get out?" "Father, what is all this about?" Sandra demanded. "What are you not telling us?" "I can't tell you. All I can do is warn you. I tried to warn you earlier, but you wouldn't listen. Now Joan is dead." "Damn it, father," Tom snapped. "I don't want to hear any more of your gibberish." He picked up the whiskey bottle from the coffee table and poured himself another. "I wouldn't mind a drop of that stuff, Tom." Tom sullenly took the bottle into the kitchen in search of a second glass. Father joined him and sat down at the kitchen table while Tom poured him a measure. He sipped it gently, as if it were medicine. Sandra watched this wreck of a man who had raised them, crushed by the years and some unspeakable fear. "Too many damn secrets in this family," she thought. "Too much bad blood in this house." She had her suspicions about what was going on. She thought she knew who it was who wouldn't leave father alone. The reason why he was so desperate to escape this house. It was almost too awful to contemplate, let alone speak of. But now it was time for the truth to come out, whatever it was, no matter how awful. "Tom, could I have a word with you in the parlour?" "Fine," he said as he followed her out. She led him over to the front door, where the foot of the stairs would screen their voices from being heard in the kitchen. "I think I know what's been going on here," she said, her voice hushed. "Well, please fill me in, because I'm at my wit's end." "I don't know how else to put this, because I can barely believe it myself, but I can think of no other explanation." "Spit it out, Sandra." "It's Mum." He blinked at her in confusion. "Mum? She's haunting him." "Oh, come on, Sandra." "I'm serious." "And Joan? Are you saying Mum's spirit killed Joan? Why would she do that? Speak sense, Sandra." Sandra bit her lip. Admittedly, Joan's death was a mystery. Perhaps spirits were lost, angry things, not quite conscious of what they were doing, just lashing out at people. She didn't understand it all. She had never really believed in ghosts, but the night's events had given her a fresh perspective and opened her mind up to the unexplainable. A door slammed upstairs, so sudden and loud that Sandra gave out a fresh shriek of terror. It sounded like the door to father's study. "What now?" said Tom, his voice weak. Sandra said nothing and went upstairs. The door to the study was shut once more. Gingerly she tried the handle and opened it, not knowing what to expect. The room was as it should be, silent and dormant. The smell from earlier was still there, the reek of old decaying things. It seemed to be concentrated around an old walnut dresser. As she stood next to it, the stench was almost unbearable. She opened its drawers and rifled through the papers and letters within. There was nothing in the dresser that could account for the unholy smell, but what about behind the dresser? Was there some damp patch of rot festering away back there? The dresser wasn't too heavy, and she was able to drag one corner of it away from the wall. The wallpaper behind it was smooth and uncorrupted, no sign of anything. But wait! Wedged between the skirting board and the wall was a small square of paper. Something had fallen behind the dresser and got stuck there. Sandra bent down and plucked it out. It was a photograph, black and white with dogged edges. It showed a woman sitting on the bonnet of a car. Sandra recognised the car. It was father's old Vauxhall, but she also recognised the woman. She had only seen her once before, when she had been a little girl. Mum had been away for the weekend. She had taken Tom to visit her parents, as Sandra remembered it. Sandra had been sick and so stayed at home with father. He wasn't much of a caregiver, and she was left to her own devices, spending most of the weekend in her room reading magazines and listening to records. She must have dozed off, for when she awoke, she had looked out of her window and saw a strange car parked below, a fancy, sporty one. The old house, usually as silent as the grave, had murmured with muffled laughter. Sandra had got out of bed and opened her bedroom door. The landing was cloaked in shadow, and the grandfather clock ticked away downstairs. The door to the bathroom was ajar, multicoloured light from its stained-glass windows spilling onto the landing. Noises came from the bathroom, giggling, the clatter of something being knocked over. Sandra had crept across the landing and peeped in through the bathroom door. Father had his back to her, his trousers around his ankles. A woman's legs were wrapped around his torso, and his face nuzzled her neck, gasping as he moved his hips back and forth. The strange light in the ugly bathroom had given the whole scene a grotesque veneer. It was like something from a nightmare, and Sandra hadn't been entirely sure that it wasn't all some ghastly fever dream. The strange woman had noticed her standing in the doorway, and she lifted her head to glare at her. There had been a look of such resentment in her eyes that it had chilled Sandra to the bone. She had turned and run back to her bedroom, closing the door behind her, diving under the covers of her bed, her face wet with tears, wishing she could just hide from everything, unsee what she had seen. As Sandra gazed at the photograph in her hands, she finally realised why she loathed that bathroom, why it squatted in her mind like an ugly old toad. The bathroom had always been there in her memory, but not the scene she had witnessed all those years ago. It was as if her mind had tried to protect her by drawing a veil over it. She had heard of repressed memories, things so awful that the mind deliberately blanks them out. Seeing her father make love to another woman at the tender age of 9 had been more than she could bear. Well, she could bear it now. She had to, because it was the key to their family's whole dirty secret. She gritted her teeth. Now she knew the secret. Now she understood. The photograph clutched in her hands, she marched downstairs. Tom and father were sitting in the kitchen, the open bottle of whiskey between them, neither speaking. "You bastard!" she snapped at her father. She held the photograph close to his face so that he could see it properly. "Where did you get that?" he gasped. "Behind the dresser in your study. She was your lover, wasn't she?" "Yes, God help me. I thought I'd burned all of her photographs and letters." "Well, you missed this one. It must have fallen behind the dresser. And you know what else? The stink, the one we've been trying to place all night, it lingered in your study like a scent trail, leading me to the dresser. I would never have found the photograph without that smell. Mum wanted me to find it, didn't she? She wanted to expose what you did and why. You murdered her, didn't you?" "Steady on, Sandra," said Tom. "Think about it, Tom. It was always a little suspicious the way she died. A blow to the head, easily disguised as a terrible accident. He murdered Mum all those years ago so he could carry on with his tart." She flung the photograph down on the coffee table. Tom picked it up to inspect it. A look of fathomless horror crossed his face. "What is it?" Sandra asked, noticing the change in his expression. "This woman," said Tom. "I've seen her before." "Where?" He sat down heavily, holding the photograph with shaking hands. "Do you remember our old clubhouse out in the woods?" "The old shed? Yes." "We used to play there all the time until father forbade us. He said it was a death trap and that he would tear it down. Do you remember we went back there just once in defiance of him?" Did she remember? Sandra racked her brain. Yes, there had been that one final time. "I remember. We were only there for a few moments. You were all gung-ho about defying father, but something changed your mind. It was so sudden." "Yes." "You saw something, didn't you? In the woods. I remember now. You refused to talk about it, but I heard you crying in your room for many nights afterwards." "You had already gone into the clubhouse," said Tom. "I was around the back, standing on that old tire we used to jump up and down on. It was autumn. All the leaves were brown and the trees were skeletal. I saw something through the trees. At first I thought it was a bit of old cloth caught on a branch, but it was a person, a woman in a long dress, just standing there looking at me. I'll never forget her face. Her mouth was stretched open as if she was screaming, but no sound was coming out, and her eyes, oh God, her eyes were wide, just like Joan's were. I ran around to the door of the clubhouse and told you we had to get out. When I looked back, I couldn't see her, but I knew she was there, watching us." "You half dragged me back home," said Sandra. "You were in such a state. Mum asked you what was wrong, but you refused to tell her. I was the only one who said we had been back to the clubhouse." "I thought father would be furious that we had disobeyed him," said Tom, but he seemed curiously satisfied somehow. He knew that whatever I had seen meant that I would be too frightened to go back there. "The woman you saw," said Sandra slowly, "was the woman in this photograph." They looked from the faded photograph to their father. He looked shrunken, as if he might sink into the fat armchair and vanish. "I didn't kill your mother," Father said. "I loved her. I wanted to be with her always. But she was going to tell her and ruin everything. I couldn't let that happen. I just couldn't." "So you murdered your mistress?" said Sandra. "My God!" "The noises," said Tom. "The scratching. The smell of damp and death. She's here, isn't she, Father? She's come back." Father shook his head. "She never left. She killed your mother, just as she killed Joan. She wants me alone in this house. She wants me to die here so that I'll be with her always. Do you see now why I have to get out of here?" "Yes," said Tom, "and we'll help you. But it won't be an old folks' home for you, Father. It'll be prison." "Fine, just get me out of this bloody house and away from her." "Not yet," said Sandra. "Not until she is put to rest." She went over to the front door and shrugged on her coat. "Where are you going?" asked Tom. "Into the woods. That woman must be found." "Do you know where she is?" "Isn't it obvious? Fetch the spade from the shed. I'll find a torch." They left their father sitting in his chair, alone with his demons. The rain had subsided to a drizzle as Sandra and Tom ventured into the woods at the back of the house. Tom glanced around at the bare trees that enclosed them on all sides, spiny silver fingers in the beams of their torch. There was no moon, and the blackness beyond the trees was impenetrable. "Are you sure this can't wait until morning?" he asked. "Yes, Peter will be here with the police soon. I want to be able to take them directly to her body. This ends tonight." The clubhouse wasn't as dilapidated as Sandra had expected. Its roof was sagging and its boards were warped and slick with algae, but it was still standing and looked like a whitened old skull as Sandra shone the torch on it. "Where do you think he buried her?" Tom asked. "Around the back?" "No," said Sandra. "Inside." "How do you know?" "That orange rug we put in there. It's rolled up to the one side. We didn't do that." They peered in through the doorway. Sandra shone the beam of her torch on a roll of rug, a sodden mess with fungi sprouting from it. The wooden boards were rotten, except 2 planks that had more of a newish gleam to them. "He must have replaced the planks he broke when he buried her," said Sandra. "You think she's under the floorboards?" said Tom nervously. Sandra knelt down and jammed the edge of the shovel between 2 boards and levered the edge of one up. "Keep that torch steady," she said. After some more levering, Sandra was able to pull up the newer boards and several on either side of them, exposing the dark earth below. "Now we dig," she said. It didn't take them long to find her. She hadn't been buried deep. Sandra supposed Father had been confident that nobody would knock down the old shed until long after he had died. The flesh was mostly rotted away, and what was left clung to the bones like old leather. The rest was hair and cloth, but the way the body was positioned gave it a horrible feeling of mobility, like it might leap up at any moment. Her arms were raised above her head, which was tilted back, the eyes and the mouth of the skull filled with loose earth. Either the pressure of the earth had forced her jaw unnaturally wide, or she had been screaming as she died. "My God," said Tom, "she was buried alive." "He couldn't," Sandra began. "He wouldn't be so cruel." "Perhaps he thought she was dead and she woke up as he piled the earth on top of her. Or perhaps he couldn't bring himself to kill her, at least not directly. He just wanted her gone, out of sight, out of mind." "He really is mad, isn't he? Perhaps he always was." Tom sighed, and they looked at the face of the dead woman for a while, listening to the patter of rain on the roof. "Come on," Tom said at last. "There's little more we can do for her. Let's get back to the house and wait for the police. Peter should be back soon." As they emerged from the trees at the rear of the house, they could see the light was on in Father's study. Sandra looked up and could make out his figure standing at the window, looking down on them. She wasn't sure, but she thought she could see another figure standing just behind him. "Tom, look!" she said, pointing at the window. Tom glanced up, but Sandra was already running towards the house. She burst in through the kitchen door and ran up the stairs. By the time she got to the study, she could see that her father was dead. He was slumped in his chair, his head tilted back, a series of blue bruises around his throat. His mouth hung open in a silent scream. It wasn't long before Peter returned along with the police. The inspector took down their stories, and then Sandra and Tom led him to the body of the woman in the woods. The following morning, after the 3 bodies had been taken away, Sandra sat in the parlour and listened to the ticking of the old grandfather clock. She felt that the house had fallen into a deep slumber, as if it had been awake for far too long and now needed to rest. She hoped it would sleep forever. The exhumed body of the woman was identified and her next of kin notified. She had been murdered almost 20 years ago and had no one but some very distant relatives. Sandra had no interest in finding out who she was. She had been found and would be given a proper burial. That was what was important. She was gone from the house and finally put to rest. The autopsy performed on the body of their father ruled out the initial suspicions that Sandra was his murderer. Her hands didn't match the series of bruises around his neck that were taken as a sign of his asphyxiation. But, as the coroner admitted, his death was a mystery, as there was no doubt that the bruises were the deep impressions of a woman's fingers. I hope you have enjoyed Bury Me Screaming by P.J. Thorndike. Be sure to check out P.J. Thorndike's full-length horror novels on Amazon or godless.com.